Well, good morning. My name is Scott Newman, if we haven't met yet, and I am the discipleship pastor here at Santa Cruz Bible. It's great to see you all here in the room, and a welcome to those of you watching online and in our lobby right now, and then a special welcome if you're watching on demand at a later point in time. We are continuing a series this morning that we're calling Spirit of Summer. And the spirit that we're talking about isn't, the summer vibes, the sand, the waves, or the green clouds that you might find downtown or on UCSC's campus, or even Venus Spirits over on the west side, although that is my favorite restaurant in Santa Cruz. It's what Christians are calling the fruit of the Spirit. Things like love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, and self-control. And so Lisette, one of our pastors, talked last week about love and how when you've tasted the goodness of God's love, that becomes the motivation for everything that we do. And so seriously, if you haven't listened to her message yet, you need to go back and check it out. It's something that you do not want to miss. But this point is absolutely critical. Because if love doesn't motivate everything that we do as Christians and to get together collectively as the church, then we have nothing to say. We have no credibility. This has been an important part of my faith journey. I was raised in the church, and like a lot of people that come to faith earlier in life or were raised in the church, the way I thought about the Christian faith was sort of like a list of do's and don'ts, what we call moralism. These are the right things to do, these are the wrong things to do, and if you just stay over on the right side of the board, you're gonna be okay. Sure, there was, preaching on love and forgiveness and things like that, but what was hammered home to me, or at least what my, adolescent brain understood was, if I, treat people kindly and don't murder, steal, kill, sleep around, things like that, look at porn, then I'm gonna be okay. As I got into high school though, that stopped sort of working for me. And so I began to get into things like studying the Bible and understanding and working at understanding, well, what does this say? How do I make sense of this? And understanding theology and how people down through church history have made sense of our faith. And so it moved from kind of this morals list of do's and don'ts understanding of the faith into sort of an intellectual thing. How does this hold together? Does this all make sense? And that worked for me for a long time. I went into ministry. I had and still have a heart and a passion for helping people see and understand and experience God as He is. But then at a certain point in time, that kind of all fell apart for me. Because I experienced a season of emotional and psychological and spiritual abuse in ministry, in the church. And the lists of rights and wrongs that I was pretty good at keeping, to be honest, and all of the intellectual, how does this all make sense, didn't protect me. It didn't keep me safe. And I entered into this time, this season of going, do I even stay a Christian? Do I even stay in ministry? Do my wife and I stay married to each other? I didn't know who I was anymore. But in the midst of all of that, what that season fueled in me was a desperation to know that I was loved, to know that I was loved by God. Because you see, I could talk all day about God's love. I've written papers and sermons on it, and my knowledge about God's love may have been this big, but my experience of it was about this big, if that. And so I realized that I needed to experience God's love, not just know about it. I needed to be formed in God's love. I needed that to really shape and become my identity and who I was. Because apart from that, I had nothing. And this realizing how little I've been formed in love, it left me with all kinds of doubts and questions. I still have doubts and questions and things that don't make sense to me and things I'm rethinking. But at the same time, as I stand here this morning, I have more confidence in Jesus and his love for me and his presence in my life than I've ever had at any other point in my life. And so this change, this experience of God's love sort of shifted how I began to look at the world around me. I began to look and to see that much of what our culture doesn't like about the church are the ways that we've substituted other things for love. And it just becomes yet another reason to ignore us and what we have to say and what we're trying to do. And the interesting thing is, and I've been watching this for a while now, and I know a little bit about history, and so I've seen this. And when our world sees us, Christians, the followers of Jesus, loving like Jesus, more often than not, that's attractive to them. And they're willing to listen to what we have to say. And so this is the big insight that I hope that we can get from this morning, is that love is the only thing that gives us credibility. It's not about how much we know. It's not about how solid our logic is. It's not about how high or firmly held our morals and convictions are. It's not about how right we are or how loudly we talk. When people see Jesus and his love in us, they'll listen to us. And when they don't see his love, they're not going to listen, no matter how right we are. And what we're going to see this morning is that that's not just sort of an interesting incidental thing. That's how God created the world to work. That's how Jesus intended it to be. So let's dive in and look at a passage of scripture that addresses this. This is a letter from the Apostle John, who was one of Jesus's closest friends in his earthly life and ministry. And this is a letter he wrote to some churches. First, the letter of 1 John, we're looking at chapter 4, verses 7 and 8. He says, "Beloved, let us love one another, because love is from God. Everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, for God is love." God is love. Love isn't just a characteristic that God has. It's not just simply one of God's attributes. Love is God, and God is love. Wherever you see love present in your life or in the world around you, that's evidence of God's presence in the world, holding it together, keeping everything from flying apart and falling apart, which we know is very difficult in our day and age, but it's there, right? And God's love flows into our lives. And when that happens, then we begin to look like love. So what does this love look like? Well, Jesus himself tells us in John 14. This is the Gospel of John. This is Jesus talking to his disciples on the night before he's betrayed from a kiss from one of his best friends. And he tells his disciples this: "I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. And by this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." So Jesus is telling us that the way he loves, the way we see him loving in his life, in his earthly ministry, the way he goes to the outcasts, to those who are on the margins of society, the way he treats with gentleness and respect those that people with power and wealth and money exclude and reject, that's the way we're supposed to love. And this This all comes from grace. This isn't something that we have to sort of work up on ourselves, because if I have to sort of match Jesus' standard, well, I might as well just wipe my hands and go home, because that ain't gonna happen, if I'm honest. It comes from grace. It comes from God's own love and life flowing into us, and then it overflows out of us to the people that we encounter. It's not something that we can manufacture. So we have to love like Jesus, and it's only when we love like Jesus that people will know that we're his disciples. Again, Jesus doesn't say it's by your airtight logic or your firmly held convictions or your tightly worked out theological systems. Nothing wrong with any of those things, but they aren't going to communicate to people that we're his disciples, that we follow Jesus, that Jesus is real and his presence is actively transforming us in the world. It's only love that will do that. Now, this passage says, love one another. So, who is this one another? Are we only supposed to love each other in this room? Everyone outside this room, going to hell in a handbasket, we don't have to worry about them or whatever. So who are we supposed to love? Well, someone came and asked Jesus that question. So I want us to, and this is where we're going to camp out for a bit this morning, Luke chapter 10. Jesus, at this point in his life, has, let's just say, a very tense relationship with the religious establishment. Because Jesus, in his teaching and in his life and in his healing, is threatening their power. He's threatening their control. And so they've basically sort of established this adversarial relationship with him. And so a religion scholar is going to come to Jesus, not to be, a sincere seeker, seeking Jesus' wisdom, but trying to trap him. So let's listen to what he says. Luke 10, starting in verse 25. Just then, a religion scholar stood up with a question to test Jesus. Teacher, what do I need to do to get eternal life? And Jesus answered, what's written in God's law? How do you interpret it? And so he said that you love the Lord your God with all your passion and prayer and muscle and intelligence, and that you love your neighbor as well as you love yourself. Good answer, said Jesus. Do this and you'll live. And so this religion scholar has the right answer, because by the time Jesus shows up on the scene, the Jewish religious leaders have been reflecting on what is the heart of our Jewish faith for centuries by this point. And they all agreed the heart of our faith in following the God of Israel is to love God and to love our neighbor, other people, which is right. Love God and love people, and love God by loving people, and love people by loving God. But the problem was that so oftentimes really smart people can end up talking themselves out of the heart of what is supposed to happen. And so, just like a good theologian or philosopher, this religion scholar answers Jesus and says, looking for a loophole, actually, he says, and just how would you define neighbor? And just imagine him going, let me get you, Jesus. So Jesus tells him a story. Jesus answered by telling a story. There was once a man traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho. On the way, he was attacked by robbers. They took his clothes, beat him up, and went off, leaving him half dead. Luckily, a priest was on his way down the same road, but when he saw him, he angled to the other side. Then a Levite religious man showed up, and he also avoided the injured man. A Samaritan traveling the road came on him. When he saw the man's condition, his heart went out to him. He gave him first aid, disinfecting and bandaging his wounds. Then he lifted him onto his donkey, led him to an inn, and made him feel comfortable. In the morning, he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, take good care of him. And if it costs any more, put it on my bill. I'll pay you on my way back." Now, what do you think? Which of the three became a neighbor to the man attacked by robbers? "The one who treated him kindly," the religion scholar responded. Jesus said, "Go and do the same." So what's going on here? I want you to imagine with me, the road from Jerusalem down to Jericho is a steep and winding and kind of remote and desolate road. And so especially in the time that Jesus lived, this was sort of a perfect place if you were a robber or a bandit to set up an ambush. And so in this imaginary story, a man is traveling down this road and gets ambushed by these bandits. Imagine you're this person. You're traveling, you're doing business, you're going to see family, something, and you get attacked and beaten up, left for dead. Everything of yours that you own in this world is now gone. And you're just lying there on the road waiting to die. Now, in your half-dazed state, you look up and you see a priest coming up the road, heading up to Jerusalem. And from the time that you were very little, as a good religious Jew, you were taught to trust the priests because they were God's appointed people to teach you and to be there for you and to care for you. And so you see this priest coming, and in your heart, you think, maybe I'm not going to die today. This isn't my day, because thank God a priest is coming up the road. And then you watch as he picks up his skirts and just skips to the other side of the road and walks on by. What are you feeling? Can you imagine the sense of betrayal and disappointment? So you close your eyes, think, okay, I'm just going to lay here and die. And then you hear some footsteps coming up the road, and you open your eyes and you see a Levite. Levites weren't priests, but they were a tribe of Israel that was given the task of also teaching God's people and then helping out with the religious observances in the temple. And so you think, finally, okay, maybe the priest had, some reasons that he couldn't help me, but this Levite is going to help me. And then the Levite too picks up his skirts, skips to the other side of the road and walks on by. What are you feeling at this point? You've been let down by not one, but two of the people that you were taught your entire life to trust had your best interests. So now you close your eyes again and you're sitting there waiting to die. And you hear footsteps a third time and you look up and you see a Samaritan. Now, Samaritans and the Jews did not get along. They were what you call enemies. They did not like each other very much, and their blood feud went back centuries. So this man sees a Samaritan coming up the road, and his heart sinks because he goes, this man hates me, and I'm not too fond of him either. And he's just going to come along and probably finish off the job that these robbers did and put me out of my misery. But then what happens? The Samaritan stops, and he kneels down, and he tends to you. He binds up your wounds. He puts you on his donkey, takes you to an inn, nurses you through the night, and pays for you to stay there until you're back to health. That's what love looks like in action. It's important to understand in this story that the religious leaders don't show compassion, not because they're callous and uncaring people. Probably. We don't know for sure. But most likely, it's for religious reasons that they don't stop to help this man. You see, the priest and the Levite were heading up to Jerusalem. That meant that they were heading to Jerusalem to go serve in the temple. And they see this man lying there in a pool of blood and bodily fluids and probably excrement and things like that. And if they had stopped to help and touch this man, they would have been ritually unclean, which meant that they could not go and serve their function in the temple. And so they walked by this man, and probably their hearts went out to him, but they went, no, I have a different and higher calling. I have to go to the temple and serve, and so I'm going to leave this man there, and if he dies, he dies, but I am serving God. Their reasons weren't because that they were jerks. Their religion got in the way of love. So I think it's an important question for us to ask ourselves: what about our religion gets in the way of loving our neighbor? Because when being right gets in the way of loving people well, you can be sure that religion is getting in the way of love. And now, don't get me wrong, religion is not a bad thing. I don't buy into the whole it's a relationship, not a religion thing. Religion should lead to relationship. But religion has gone off the rails when it gets in the way of love. So, for example, as a church, we've been really clear that when it comes to marriage and sexuality, we hold a historic Christian ethic, that marriage is between a man and a woman. We also believe really strongly that we are called to be a space of love for everyone. And we're called to be a community that loves and serves the queer community around us and creates spaces where they can heal from the trauma they've received in other religious spaces and come to encounter God's love. Which shouldn't be that radical, and yet people have really kicked against that because they're afraid that if we're even simply being loving to people that we might disagree with, that we're giving away the whole thing, that we're not being faithful. But that's rightness getting in the way of love. Amen. So is it really right? Here's another example. A couple months ago, I attended the fundraising banquet for the Pregnancy Resource Center here in Santa Cruz. The PRC helps and serves vulnerable women when they're pregnant, giving them education on their options and things like that. And of course, they hope that women carry their babies to term. But one of the things they do, and I'm so proud of them for this, is that even when their clients that they've counseled choose to get an abortion, they continue to love and serve and support them along that journey. And it's a beautiful way that they love like Jesus. But would you imagine that they're getting pushback on that from Christians in our community, thinking that that's being soft on abortion? You might be right, maybe, but when your rightness gets in the way of loving people well, are we really right? So what this leads to is a huge credibility problem for the church. Because according to Jesus, love is what we should be known for first and foremost. But what are Christians known for in our world today? Well, unfortunately, and we're known, and we all have a responsibility in this. We're known for being judgmental and arrogant and hypocritical and fearful and reactionary. When I came to Santa Cruz, I was the youth pastor here for the first year and a half or so. And the students in our youth group, when they would let their friends know, or their friends would find out that they were Christians, the first question they would be asked was, "Oh, you're a Christian. Why do you hate gay people?" The first question. That's what they're known for. So we have a credibility problem because we're not known for love. And when people who grow up in the church, believing that we're called to follow in the way of Jesus, not just believe the right things, but also live in the way of Jesus, and then we see religion or theology getting in the way of loving well, that's what leads to the phenomena in our world today that's called deconstruction. Or maybe some of you have heard of the ex-evangelical movement. This is people that are rethinking their faith, changing their faith, sometimes even leaving the faith, at least for a period of time. And it's not about, I've heard lots of pastors get on the deconstruction movement and say, it's just people needing an excuse to sin more. They just want to sin more, and so they're going through this phase of deconstruction. What if deconstruction wasn't so much about losing faith as about trying to be true to the Jesus that we experience through Scripture? A couple years ago, I wrote a little post on Facebook on deconstruction and encouraging people to not see it as something to be scared of, but actually a way that faith is deepening in people. And a guy that I had gone to school with, and we were in youth group together, his name was Josh, he messaged me and said, thank you so much for saying that. And he's gone through his own deconstruction journey. I'm not even sure if he would identify himself as a Christian anymore. But he said this, and this was so fascinating to me. He said, it's always the kids in youth group or the kids growing up in church or the kids in college that are most serious about their faith that end up going through deconstruction. Not because it wasn't real, it's because it was, and then they look at how much of what we call Christian culture doesn't actually follow in the way of love or of Jesus. And when they try to follow in the way of love, the way of Jesus, they get called liberals. They get called bleeding hearts. They get called woke for trying to love like Jesus. So that's why this is a thing. And if the church can be known as a place of love, as a place that actually follows in the way of Jesus, we become a safe space for people to walk through that process and come out the other end with their faith intact. So what's the way forward? How do we as Santa Cruz Bible, how do we as individuals move forward given this reality? One of my favorite quotes the last few years comes from Karl Rahner, who was a theologian in the 20th century. He said this, he said, the devout Christian of the future will either be a mystic, meaning one who has experienced something, or he will cease to be anything at all. The Christian of the future will be a mystic or nothing at all. And what he means by this is simply that we need desperately to experience God's love. It's not enough to say that God is love. It's not enough to talk about God's love. It's not enough to explain what love is. We need to know deep down in our bones that we are loved. That right here as we sit in our seats this morning, that you and I could not be more loved or less loved than we are by the God who created us. That we are created and exist from love, of love, and for love. This is who we are. Love is our identity. But this is so far from our experience most of the time, myself included. And so this requires a practice. A practice doesn't make God do anything in our lives. A practice is simply putting ourselves in the way of God's love as it flows into us so we can experience it and overflow in that love to every single person that we encounter around us. And God's love has to reach every part of our being. And so here's a practice, a question and a practice for this coming week. So in the quiet moments, when you're awake at night, when you're most honest with yourself, where do you not just want to believe that God's love is real and true? Where do you want to feel that God's love sees you, knows you, and holds you? Because we all have those places in our lives that we don't have compassion towards, that we don't experience the love of God flowing towards. But when we recognize that even the deepest, darkest, most hidden, most embarrassing places in our lives are seen and known and loved by the God that created us, of love, from love, and for love, that will change everything. We can't help but then overflow in love to every person we come across, whether they're friend or whether they're our enemy, whether they're like us or whether they're different, whether we agree with them or whether we disagree with them. Love will simply flow out of us because we've received God's love for the deepest and the darkest places in our lives. It's when we all become mystics, as Karl Rahner put it, people who not just know about God's love, but make space to experience it and let it overflow out of our lives, that our words will finally again have weight in our world. And if this is resonating with you, or maybe it's not resonating with you, maybe you're deeply troubled by this, I want to encourage you. One of the book groups that we're doing this summer is reading through a book called When Everything's on Fire by Brian Zahnd, and it's examining this whole deconstruction movement. And one of the things I love about this book is that he doesn't spend time ragging on the church. He names the problems that we all have, but he offers us a way forward, and it's the way of encountering God's love and being changed and transformed by it. And so we've already met once, but we're going to meet 3 more times. It's not too late to jump in and sign up. So I would encourage you, if you're curious about this whole thing, or maybe you're confused about it, you like what I've said, you're troubled by what I've said, come and join us, because we're going to be having lots of great discussions about this throughout the rest of the summer. Let's go ahead and pray as we close out this morning. This is a prayer adapted from a mystic in the 20th century named Adrian von Speyr. Lord, set us free and take us to yourself. You've shown us that the chains that hold us back from our way, and if they still exist to hinder us, it is for no other reason than that in our heart of hearts we are not yet willing to detach ourselves from them. How often we moan and groan and regret having so little freedom, whereas all we really mean are the obligations that daily life and our jobs and responsibilities entail. But these obligations do not really block our paths. They do not affect its essential course, at most its outer form. If anything, they are perhaps just little tests. What weighs so heavily does not come from outside. It lives and takes shape in our own selves. I mean everything to which we are attached, which we are not disposed to renounce, which serves us as a crutch and a convenience, everything to which we believe we have a right. So take, Lord, we are trying to ask you for this sincerely. Everything that in our eyes is part of our rightful spiritual property, but that paralyzes our love for you, that makes your love for our neighbor stop flowing and freeze solid. Let us disappear in the flow of your love to all people so that it can pour itself out unhindered. Amen.